The eviction notice arrived on a Tuesday morning, slipped beneath the apartment door while Sarah was making breakfast for her 2 daughters. She found it when Emma knocked over her juice, and Sarah bent to wipe the floor. The paper lay there, official and final, folded once and marked with the building management's stamp. 30 days. That was what it said. 30 days to vacate or face legal action. The words were precise and impersonal, offering no acknowledgment that this wasn't just a unit number, but a home where 2 children slept and dreamed and believed their mother could protect them from everything. Sarah read it twice before folding it again and tucking it into her pocket. Emma and Lily sat at the small kitchen table, oblivious, arguing over who had finished their cereal first. They were 7 and 9, old enough to sense when something was wrong, but young enough that Sarah could still shield them from the worst of it. She forced a smile, cleared the dishes, and sent them to brush their teeth. When they left the room, she leaned against the counter and allowed herself 10 seconds of stillness, eyes closed, breathing controlled. Then she straightened and began preparing their lunches for school. The financial collapse had not been dramatic or sudden. It had been erosion, steady and relentless. First, the hours at the restaurant were cut when business slowed. Then the car needed repairs that drained what little she had saved. Medical bills from Lily's respiratory infection the previous winter had piled up faster than Sarah could negotiate payment plans. Each month, she juggled which bills to pay in full and which to delay. A careful calculus that bought time, but never solved the underlying problem. The rent increase 3 months earlier had tipped the balance beyond recovery. She had asked for more time, explained her situation, promised she would catch up. The response had been sympathetic but firm. Business was business. That evening, after the girls were asleep, Sarah sat at the kitchen table with her laptop and searched for apartments she could afford. The options narrowed quickly. Anything within her budget was either too far from the girls' school or located in neighborhoods where she would not feel safe walking them home after dark. She expanded her search, looking at rooms for rent, shared housing, places that would require her to dismantle the small life she had built for her daughters. Each listing felt like a compromise, a step backward from the stability she had fought so hard to create. It was during one of these searches, deep into the night when exhaustion blurred her focus, that she stumbled across something entirely different. An auction listing, municipal surplus property, available for minimal bids due to structural damage and remediation costs. Most of the properties were abandoned warehouses or condemned commercial buildings, far beyond what anyone would consider livable. But one entry caught her attention. A church. Not just any church, but what the listing described as a cathedral, though the accompanying photographs made that term feel aspirational at best. The structure stood alone on a corner lot, its stone facade blackened by fire and time. The roof had partially collapsed, leaving jagged gaps where the sky showed through. Windows were shattered or missing entirely, their frames empty and dark. Graffiti covered the lower walls, layered over years of neglect. The description was blunt: structural damage extensive, interior gutted by fire, asbestos remediation required, no utilities, condemned for occupancy. Estimated restoration cost exceeds current market value. Starting bid, $1. Sarah stared at the photographs, her exhaustion sharpening into a strange clarity. $1. The building was worthless by any reasonable measure, a liability rather than an asset. Yet the images held something that the apartment listings did not. Space. The cathedral, ruined as it was, occupied an entire city block. Its ceilings, even collapsed in places, had once soared. Its walls, scorched and broken, were thick stone that had stood for over a century. There was a kind of stubborn permanence to it, a refusal to be erased entirely. She told herself it was absurd. A destroyed building was not a solution to homelessness. It was a disaster in a different form, a burden that would consume whatever resources she still had. Yet she could not close the browser tab. She returned to it throughout the following day, during her lunch break at the restaurant, while waiting for the girls after school, late at night, when sleep would not come. Each time, the photographs revealed details she had not noticed before. The stone steps leading to the main entrance, worn smooth by generations of feet. The carved symbols above the doorway, their meaning obscured by soot but still present. The way light entered through the broken roof, illuminating sections of the interior with an almost deliberate beauty. By Thursday, Sarah had researched the property more thoroughly. The cathedral had been built in the early 1900s, serving a congregation that had dwindled and eventually disbanded in the 1970s. It had stood vacant for decades, passing through various owners who had planned renovations that never materialized. The fire that gutted the interior had occurred 8 years earlier, arson suspected, but never proven. Since then, the building had belonged to the city, classified as a nuisance property, awaiting either demolition or a buyer willing to accept its liabilities. She read municipal codes, zoning regulations, and inspection reports. The building was structurally unsound in places, but not entirely beyond repair. The stone walls were intact, the foundation solid despite surface damage. The roof would need complete reconstruction, as would most of the interior. Asbestos removal alone would cost tens of thousands of dollars. Yet the property taxes were minimal, suspended pending demolition orders that had been delayed repeatedly by bureaucratic inertia. If someone bought it, they would own it outright, with no mortgage, no landlord, no threat of eviction. Sarah began to consider the impossible, not as a home, not immediately, but as something else. A placeholder, a piece of ground she could claim while she figured out what came next. Even if she could not live there legally, ownership would give her options. She could sell it later, perhaps for more than $1. She could use it as collateral. At minimum, it would be hers, a line drawn against the constant retreat she had been forced to make. On Friday evening, she told her mother about the auction. The conversation did not go as she had hoped. Her mother, seated in the living room of the small house where Sarah had grown up, listened with an expression that shifted from concern to disbelief. A church? A burned church? Her mother's voice carried the sharpness that came with years of watching Sarah make decisions she disagreed with. "Sarah, you can't be serious." "It's not burned entirely," Sarah said, though she knew how weak the distinction sounded. "The structure is still standing. You have 30 days to find a place to live, and you're thinking about buying a ruin?" Her mother leaned forward, hands gripping the armrests of her chair. "This is exactly the kind of thing you do, chasing something impossible instead of focusing on what's practical." Sarah felt the familiar tightening in her chest. The defensiveness that came from knowing her mother was not entirely wrong. "I'm trying to find something we can afford. The apartments I can rent are worse than staying where we are, and I can't stay where we are." "Then come here," her mother said, not for the first time. "You and the girls, just until you get back on your feet." Sarah had considered it. She had considered it so many times that the thought had worn grooves in her mind. But her mother's house was small, the relationship between them already strained by years of well-meaning criticism and unmet expectations. Moving back would feel like confirmation of every doubt her mother had voiced when Sarah decided to raise the girls alone, to leave their father, to insist she could manage without help. "I need to do this myself," Sarah said quietly. Her mother sighed, a sound heavy with resignation. $1 doesn't mean it's free, Sarah. That building will cost you everything you don't have." The words followed Sarah home, repeating in her mind as she lay awake that night. Her mother was right in the practical sense. Buying the cathedral was not a solution. It was a gamble, one she could not afford to lose. Yet the alternative, accepting her mother's offer, or moving into a place that would hollow out what little dignity she had left, felt equally impossible. By Saturday morning, Sarah had made her decision. She registered for the auction, uploaded the required identification, and confirmed her intent to bid. The process was impersonal and efficient, requiring only a few clicks. When the auction opened on Monday, she watched the listing from her phone during her lunch break. No one else bid. The cathedral sat unclaimed, its starting price of $1 apparently still too high for anyone else to consider. At 2:47 p.m., with 7 minutes remaining before the auction closed, Sarah placed her bid. $1. She submitted it and waited, her heart pounding harder than the moment warranted. The confirmation arrived seconds later. Winning bid. Property awarded pending final processing and payment. She stared at the screen, reading the words again to be certain. She had done it. For $1, she now owned a ruined cathedral on the east side of the city, a building no one else wanted, condemned and abandoned. It was absurd. It was reckless. And for the first time in months, Sarah felt something that resembled hope. The reaction from those around her ranged from bewilderment to outright mockery. Her co-worker at the restaurant, a woman named Janet who had worked there for 15 years, laughed when Sarah mentioned it during their shift. "A church? You bought a church?" Janet shook her head, smiling in a way that was not unkind, but carried no belief. "Honey, what are you going to do with a church?" "I don't know yet," Sarah admitted. "You're going to end up with a pile of bricks and a tax bill," Janet said, still smiling. "But hey, at least it was cheap." Her brother called that evening after their mother told him. His tone was gentler than their mother's, but the message was the same. "Sarah, I get it. You're desperate. But this isn't the answer. You can't live in a condemned building with 2 kids." "I know that," Sarah said, though she had not fully accepted it yet. "Then what's the plan?" She did not have a plan, not one she could articulate. The silence stretched long enough that her brother filled it himself. "Look," he said, "if you need money, I can help a little. Not much, but something. Just don't throw away what you have on a building that's going to fall down around you." Sarah thanked him and ended the call, feeling the weight of everyone's concern pressing down like a physical thing. They were not wrong to worry. They were not wrong to doubt. But they also did not understand what it felt like to have no options that did not require surrendering something essential. The cathedral, ruined as it was, belonged to her now. That alone made it different from everything else. She waited until the following weekend to visit the property with the girls. She had explained it to them carefully, framing it as an adventure rather than a necessity. They drove across the city in her aging sedan, the girls quiet in the back seat, sensing that this trip mattered in ways they could not yet name. The cathedral looked worse in person than in the photographs. Sarah parked across the street and sat for a moment, letting the reality settle over her. The building was enormous, far larger than she had imagined. Its stone walls rose 3 stories, though sections near the top had crumbled, leaving ragged edges against the sky. The front entrance was boarded over, the heavy wooden doors barely visible behind sheets of plywood, marked with faded warnings. The lot around it was overgrown with weeds and scattered with debris, remnants of the neighborhood's slow decline. "Is this it?" Emma asked from the back seat, her voice small. "Yes," Sarah said, trying to sound confident. "It looks scary," Lily said. Sarah turned to face them, reaching back to take their hands. "It looks different than what we're used to, but it's ours. That means we get to decide what happens to it." The girls did not look convinced, but they followed her out of the car and across the street. Sarah approached the main entrance, feeling the weight of the building's presence. Up close, the details became clearer. The stone was blackened, but not destroyed, its surface textured by time and heat. The steps leading up to the door were solid beneath her feet, worn but unbroken. She tested the boards covering the entrance and found them loose, secured only by a few remaining nails. "Stay close to me," she told the girls, then pulled one of the boards aside, creating a gap wide enough to slip through. The interior greeted them with the smell of ash and damp stone, a combination that was not pleasant, but not unbearable. Light entered through the broken roof in broad shafts, illuminating sections of the space while leaving others in shadow. The floor was littered with debris, charred wood beams, shattered glass, fragments of what had once been pews or walls. But beneath the destruction, the bones of the building remained. The stone columns that had supported the roof still stood, their surfaces scorched but intact. The walls rose around them, their height creating an acoustic space that made even small sounds echo softly. Sarah walked slowly through the main hall, the girls flanking her, their hands gripping hers tightly. She could feel their fear, but also their curiosity. Emma pointed to the far end, where a large circular window, though cracked, still held fragments of colored glass that caught the light and cast faint patterns on the floor below. "It's like a castle," Emma said quietly. "A broken castle," Lily corrected, but her tone carried less fear now. They explored carefully, Sarah testing each step before allowing the girls to follow. The side rooms were in worse condition than the main hall, their ceilings collapsed entirely in places, exposing rusted pipes and tangled wiring. The basement entrance was blocked by fallen beams, and Sarah did not attempt to move them. Enough of the building was accessible to understand its scale, its potential, and its overwhelming disrepair. By the time they returned to the car, the girls were talking more freely, pointing out details they had noticed, asking questions about what the building had looked like before the fire. Sarah answered as best she could, grateful that their initial fear had softened into something closer to interest. That night, after putting the girls to bed, Sarah sat alone in the quiet apartment and allowed herself to confront the reality fully. She owned a building she could not afford to repair, could not legally occupy, and could not easily sell. The decision that had felt bold days earlier now felt reckless, a mistake born of desperation rather than strategy. Yet even as doubt crept in, she thought of the cathedral's stone walls, still standing after a century, after fire, after abandonment. There was something in that endurance that refused to let her dismiss the building entirely. Over the following days, Sarah began to research what it would take to make the space usable, not as a home immediately, but as something. She learned about structural assessments, asbestos abatement, zoning variances for residential conversion. Every answer led to another question. Every solution required money she did not have. Still, she continued, driven by a need to understand what she had taken on, even if she could not yet act on that understanding. She returned to the cathedral alone on a Wednesday morning, using her day off to explore more thoroughly. This time, she brought a flashlight, work gloves, and a notebook. She moved through the building methodically, documenting what she saw, sketching rough layouts of the rooms, noting where repairs would be critical and where they could wait. The work was tedious, but grounding, giving structure to what had felt overwhelmingly chaotic. It was during this second visit, while examining the area near the altar at the far end of the main hall, that Sarah first noticed something unusual. The floor in this section was different from the rest. While most of the cathedral's floor was stone, worn smooth by generations of footsteps, the area directly in front of where the altar had stood was covered by heavy wooden panels. They were charred along the edges, but the center sections remained intact, their surfaces darker and denser than the surrounding materials. Sarah knelt and tested one of the panels, pressing her weight against it. It did not move. She ran her fingers along the edge, feeling for gaps or seams, and found a narrow space where the panel met the stone floor. When she shone her flashlight into the gap, she saw nothing but darkness, deeper than she expected. She tried lifting the panel, but it was heavier than it looked, secured by something beneath the surface. Sarah stood and examined the surrounding area. The panels formed a rectangle roughly 10 feet by 6 feet, positioned precisely where the altar's foundation would have been. It was not unusual for churches to have crypts or storage spaces beneath the altar, but the deliberate covering suggested this space had been sealed intentionally, not simply closed for convenience. Sarah returned to her car and retrieved a crowbar from the trunk, a tool she had brought without knowing why. Back inside, she wedged the crowbar into the gap between the panel and the stone floor, leveraging it carefully. The wood resisted at first, then gave suddenly, the panel lifting just enough for her to slide her fingers beneath it. She repositioned her grip and pulled, the wood groaning as old nails released their hold. When the panel came free, Sarah set it aside and looked into the opening. A narrow staircase descended into darkness, its steps stone and steep, disappearing beyond the reach of her flashlight. The air that rose from below was cooler than the surrounding space, carrying with it the faint mineral smell of deep earth and old stone. Sarah stood at the edge of the opening, her pulse quickening. Every instinct told her to proceed carefully, to wait, to bring someone else before descending into an unknown space. Yet she also knew that waiting meant giving fear time to solidify into inaction. She adjusted her flashlight, tested the first step with her weight, and began to descend. The staircase was narrow, barely wide enough for her shoulders, and the walls on either side were rough stone, unfinished and cold to the touch. She counted the steps as she went, finding reassurance in the rhythm. 12 steps down, then a small landing where the staircase turned. Another 12 steps, then another turn. By the time she reached the bottom, she had descended roughly 30 feet below the cathedral's main floor, far deeper than she had expected. The space at the bottom opened into a chamber carved directly from the bedrock beneath the building. It was not large, perhaps 20 feet square, but its ceiling was high enough that Sarah could stand without bending. The walls were lined with alcoves, each recessed into the stone, their interiors dark and empty. The floor was smooth, worn by feet that had walked here long ago, and at the center of the chamber stood a single stone pedestal, its surface flat and unmarked. Sarah swept her flashlight across the room, taking in the details slowly. This was not a crypt. There were no markers, no inscriptions, no evidence of burial. It felt more like a storage space, designed to hold something valuable enough to justify the effort of its construction. Yet the alcoves were empty, their surfaces bare except for a thin layer of dust that suggested they had been undisturbed for years. She approached the pedestal and examined it closely. The stone was smooth and cold, its edges sharp despite its age. There were no visible seams or joints, as if it had been carved from a single piece of rock. When she pressed her hand against its surface, she felt a faint texture, not quite rough, but irregular in a way that suggested intentional design rather than natural wear. Sarah knelt and ran her flashlight along the base of the pedestal, looking for markings or inscriptions. At first, she saw nothing. Then, as she shifted her angle, the light caught a series of shallow grooves etched into the stone near the floor. They were faint, almost invisible, unless the light struck them directly, but they formed a pattern. Not letters exactly, but symbols, repeated in a sequence that suggested meaning. She traced the grooves with her finger, feeling their depth and precision. Whoever had carved them had worked carefully, ensuring they would survive time even as they remained hidden from casual observation. Sarah copied the symbols into her notebook, unsure what they meant, but certain they mattered. As she stood to leave, her flashlight beam swept across one of the alcoves again, and this time she noticed something she had missed before. In the farthest alcove, partially obscured by shadow, was a darker patch on the wall. Not damage, but a deliberate variation in the stone's surface. Sarah crossed the chamber and leaned closer, shining her light directly on the spot. It was a seam, narrow and precise, running vertically from the floor to the top of the alcove. She pressed her hand against it, and the stone shifted slightly. Not much, but enough to confirm that it was not solid. It was a panel, disguised to blend with the surrounding wall. Sarah's breath quickened as she examined the edges of the panel, looking for a way to open it. She found a small indentation near the bottom, just large enough for her fingers. She hooked them into the space and pulled. The panel resisted at first, then gave with a grinding sound, sliding outward to reveal a narrow cavity behind it. Inside the cavity, stacked neatly in rows, were small wooden boxes. They were old, their surfaces darkened by time, but intact. Sarah reached in and lifted one carefully. It was heavier than she expected, dense and solid. She set it on the floor and opened the lid. What she saw inside took several seconds to process. The box was filled with stones, small and irregular, some no larger than gravel, others the size of marbles. They caught her flashlight beam and reflected it back in sharp, brilliant flashes of light. Sarah picked up one of the stones, turning it in her hand. It was transparent, cold, and hard, with internal fractures that bent the light in ways that suggested depth rather than simplicity. She knew immediately, even without expertise, what she was holding. Diamonds. Raw, uncut, but unmistakably real. She set the stone back carefully and opened another box. It contained the same thing, stones of varying sizes, all diamonds. She opened a third box, then a fourth. Each held the same treasure, carefully packed and hidden. Sarah's hands began to shake as the implications settled over her. This was not a small collection. The cavity behind the panel was deep, and the boxes extended far into the darkness. She pulled out another, then another, counting as she went. 10 boxes. 20. 30. She stopped counting when she reached 50, her mind struggling to comprehend the scale of what she had found. She sat back on the floor, staring at the opened boxes around her. The chamber, silent and cold, held no answers to the questions flooding her mind. Who had placed these here? When? And why had they never been recovered? The symbols on the pedestal, the hidden panel, the depth of the chamber, all of it suggested a deliberate effort to conceal something of immense value. Yet the building had stood abandoned for decades, and no one had come for this. Sarah's first instinct was to close everything, to seal the panel and leave, to process what she had found before taking any action. But another part of her, the part that had learned to survive on limited resources and constant pressure, understood that this discovery changed everything. Not immediately, not without verification, but fundamentally. She carefully replaced the boxes, closed the panel, and marked the alcove in her mind. She would return. She would document this properly. But for now, she needed to leave before the weight of what she had found overwhelmed her ability to think clearly. The ascent back up the staircase felt longer than the descent, each step deliberate and measured. When she emerged into the main hall, the light streaming through the broken roof seemed brighter, almost harsh. Sarah replaced the wooden panel over the opening, securing it as best she could, and left the cathedral. Sitting in her car, hands still trembling, She stared at the building's facade. The same ruined structure everyone had dismissed, mocked, or pitied her for buying. Inside it, hidden beneath layers of stone and time, was something no one had known existed. Something that might be worth more than she could imagine. Sarah started the car and drove home slowly. Her mind racing through possibilities and fears in equal measure. She did not yet know what the diamonds were worth, or how she would prove ownership, or what complications would arise from their discovery. But she knew, with a certainty that steadied her shaking hands, that the cathedral was no longer just a gamble. It was something else entirely. The first person Sarah told was no one. She carried the knowledge alone for 3 days, moving through her routines with a heightened awareness that made everything feel both urgent and unreal. She worked her shifts at the restaurant, prepared meals for the girls, packed boxes in preparation for the move. She still did not know how to execute. But beneath all of it, the memory of the chamber played constantly in her mind. The weight of the stones in her hand, the sharp reflections of light. The impossible scale of what she had found. By Friday, the silence had become unbearable. She needed confirmation, some external validation that she had not imagined or misunderstood what she had seen. She called her brother, not to tell him everything, but to ask a carefully framed question. "Do you remember when we were kids?" she began, keeping her voice casual. "And Dad used to talk about the old churches downtown? Did he ever mention anything about them hiding valuables during wars or economic collapses?" Her brother paused, and she could hear him shifting the phone. "I remember him saying something about that, yeah." "Why?" "Just curious," Sarah said. "I've been researching the cathedral, trying to understand its history." "Sarah." His tone shifted, losing its casual quality. "You're not getting obsessed with that place, are you?" "Because it's one thing to own it, but it's another to sink your life into it." "I'm just learning," she said, avoiding the question. After the call ended, Sarah searched online for historical records of the cathedral. She found scattered references in city archives, digitized newspapers from the early 1900s that mentioned the building's construction and dedication. One article from 1932 caught her attention. It described the cathedral's role during the Depression, noting that local churches had served as informal banks for parishioners who distrusted financial institutions after the crashes. The article did not mention diamonds specifically, but it referenced substantial assets held in trust for the congregation that had been secured in accordance with the practices of the time. Sarah printed the article and added it to a growing folder of documents. She found other references too. Records of the cathedral's closure in the 1970s, mentions of disputes over the building's ownership, notes about items that had been removed before the final abandonment. But nowhere was there any clear accounting of what had remained, or what might have been deliberately hidden. On Saturday, Sarah returned to the cathedral with a better camera, more lights, and a determination to document everything methodically before taking any further action. She descended into the chamber again, this time photographing every detail. The pedestal, the alcoves, the symbols carved into the stone, the hidden panel, and finally, the boxes themselves. She opened each box and photographed its contents, careful not to disturb the arrangement of the stones. As she worked, she began to notice variations she had missed during the first visit. Some boxes contained only small stones, others held larger pieces. A few contained diamonds that were clearer, with fewer internal fractures, while others held stones that were more opaque, their surfaces rougher. Sarah was not an expert, but even her untrained eye could see that the collection represented a range of quality and size. She took notes, marking which boxes held what, creating an inventory that would allow her to prove, if needed, that she had not removed or altered anything before seeking professional assessment. By the time she finished, the afternoon light filtering through the broken roof had shifted, casting longer shadows across the main hall. Sarah closed the panel, replaced the wooden covering over the staircase entrance, and left the building with her camera and notebook filled with evidence that would either validate her discovery or reveal some misunderstanding she had not yet considered. That evening, after the girls were asleep, Sarah sat at her laptop and began researching how one goes about verifying diamonds. The process was more complex than she had anticipated. Certification required gemologists, specialized equipment, and formal appraisals that could take weeks. But before any of that, she needed to establish ownership clearly, to ensure that the discovery would not be challenged or contested. She drafted an email to a property lawyer, carefully describing her situation without revealing the full scope of what she had found. She mentioned that she had discovered items of potential value in the building and wanted to understand her legal rights as the property owner. The response came 2 days later, brief but helpful. As the legal owner of the property, anything found within it belonged to her, provided it was not stolen property or subject to existing claims. If the items had been abandoned with the building, they were hers. The lawyer's words gave Sarah the confidence to take the next step. She contacted a gemologist in the city, explaining that she had inherited items she believed might be diamonds and needed professional verification. The gemologist, a woman named Dr. Helen Carr, agreed to meet at her office the following week. Sarah prepared carefully for that meeting. She selected 3 stones from different boxes, choosing examples that represented the range of quality she had observed. She placed them in a small cloth pouch, then sealed the pouch in an envelope marked with the date and her signature. On the morning of the appointment, she told her boss at the restaurant that she had a medical issue to address, a lie that came easier than she expected, and drove across the city to Dr. Carr's office. The office was located in a building that served several jewelry and appraisal businesses, its lobby lined with display cases showing polished gems and finished pieces. Dr. Carr's suite was smaller and more functional, dominated by a large desk equipped with magnification tools, scales, and testing equipment. The gemologist herself was older, perhaps in her 60s, with short silver hair and glasses that magnified her eyes slightly when she looked up. "Miss Patterson?" Dr. Carr stood and extended a hand. "Please, sit." Sarah sat, clutching the envelope. "I appreciate you seeing me. You mentioned on the phone that you had items to verify." Dr. Carr's tone was professional, neither warm nor cold. "May I see them?" Sarah opened the envelope and removed the pouch, setting it on the desk. Dr. Carr untied it and poured the 3 stones onto a white cloth, spreading them with her finger so they did not touch. She said nothing for a long moment, then reached for a loupe and examined the first stone. The silence stretched. Dr. Carr moved to the second stone, then the third, her expression unreadable. She set down the loupe and picked up a different tool, a device with a small probe that she touched to each stone in turn. The machine emitted a soft beep after each contact. Finally, Dr. Carr looked up. "Where did you get these?" Sarah had prepared for this question. "I inherited a property. These were found inside." "Do you have documentation of the property's ownership?" "Yes." Sarah pulled out the auction receipt and deed, both notarized and official. Dr. Carr examined them briefly, then returned her attention to the stones. "These are diamonds," she said, her voice steady. "Rough, uncut, but natural diamonds. Given their size and clarity, they're valuable." Sarah felt her breath catch, even though she had expected this confirmation. "How valuable?" Dr. Carr picked up the largest of the 3 stones, turning it under the light. "This one alone, if cut properly, could yield a finished stone worth $50,000 to $70,000. The smaller ones, perhaps $20,000 to $30,000 each. But that's only if they're cut well. Rough stones like these are always a gamble. And if there were more? Sarah asked carefully. Dr. Carr looked at her directly. How many more? Enough to fill 50 boxes, maybe more. The gemologist set down the stone slowly. Ms. Patterson, if that's true, you need to secure those items immediately and contact authorities. A discovery of that scale is not something you handle casually. They're secure, Sarah said. No one knows about them except me. I just needed to know if they were real before I took any further steps. Dr. Carr nodded, her expression shifting to something closer to respect. They're real. And if you have as many as you say, you're looking at a significant fortune. Rough diamonds are harder to value than finished stones. But conservatively, if each box contains even 100 carats of usable material, you could be holding tens of millions of dollars, possibly more. The number did not feel real. Sarah heard it, understood the words, but could not attach meaning to them. Tens of millions. It was an abstraction, too large to fit into the framework of her life. What should I do? Sarah asked. Dr. Carr leaned back, folding her hands. First, you need a formal appraisal of the entire collection. That will require bringing in additional experts, possibly multiple gemologists, and an independent auditor. Second, you need to establish clear legal ownership to prevent any disputes. Third, if the value is as high as I suspect, you'll need security, insurance, and legal representation before you attempt to sell or move the stones. Sarah nodded, trying to process the steps, even as her mind spun with the implications. Can you help with the appraisal? I can coordinate it, Dr. Carr said. But I'll need access to the collection and time to assemble a team. This isn't something that happens overnight. I understand. Dr. Carr wrote down a figure on a piece of paper and slid it across the desk. This is my estimate for the 3 stones you brought. Conservative, but realistic. If the rest of the collection is similar in quality, you can extrapolate from there. Sarah looked at the number. $150,000 for 3 stones. If there were thousands of stones, the total became incomprehensible. She folded the paper and tucked it into her pocket. Next to the eviction notice that she had carried with her every day since it arrived. Thank you, Sarah said quietly. Ms. Patterson. Dr. Carr's tone softened slightly. Be careful. Discoveries like this attract attention, and not all of it will be welcome. Secure the site, tell as few people as possible, and move quickly once you're ready. This is life-changing, but it's also complicated. Sarah left the office with the 3 stones returned to her pouch and Dr. Carr's contact information saved in her phone. The afternoon sun felt too bright, the sounds of the city too loud. She sat in her car for a long time, staring at the steering wheel, before finally starting the engine and driving back toward the cathedral. Life-changing, the phrase repeated in her mind as she navigated traffic. The eviction notice in her pocket no longer mattered. The rent she could not pay, the apartments she could not afford, the crushing weight of financial collapse, all of it had become irrelevant in a matter of minutes. Yet the relief she expected did not come. Instead, she felt a different kind of pressure, the weight of responsibility, of decisions that would shape not just her future, but her daughters' futures in ways she could not yet predict. When she reached the cathedral, Sarah parked and sat looking at the building's ruined facade. The same walls everyone else saw as worthless now contained something that would change everything. She thought of her mother's dismissal, her brother's concern, Janet's laughter. They had all been right to doubt, in a way. The building was a ruin, but they had been wrong about what that meant. Sarah got out of the car and walked toward the entrance, feeling the weight of what she carried. Not the stones in her pocket, but the knowledge of what lay hidden below. She would need to tell people soon. She would need help, protection, a plan. But for now, in this moment, the secret was still hers alone. She removed the boards from the entrance and stepped inside, letting the cool air of the cathedral settle around her. The light through the broken roof illuminated the same patterns on the floor, the same stone columns reaching toward the sky. Nothing had changed visibly, yet everything had shifted beneath the surface. Sarah crossed the main hall and stood over the wooden panels that concealed the staircase. She pressed her hand against the charred wood, feeling its solidity. Below it, in the darkness, the chamber waited with its impossible treasure. And above it, through the broken roof, the sky stretched endless and indifferent. The discovery had given her something she had not expected. Not just wealth, though that would come, but a kind of vindication. Everyone who had dismissed her decision, who had seen her purchase of the cathedral as desperation or foolishness, would now have to confront the fact that the impossible gamble had paid off in ways none of them could have imagined. Sarah smiled faintly, not with triumph, but with quiet recognition. The cathedral, ruined and abandoned, had held more than she could have known. And now, because she had been willing to take the risk everyone else refused, it belonged to her. She turned and left the building, locking the boards back into place behind her. The work ahead would be complex and demanding, but it no longer felt insurmountable. The fortune hidden beneath the cathedral's floor had given her something more valuable than money, though that would come too. It had given her ground to stand on, solid and unshakable, in a world that had spent months eroding everything beneath her feet. The formal appraisal process began 2 weeks later, after Sarah had secured the necessary legal documentation and arranged for Dr. Carr to bring her team to the site. In the intervening days, Sarah had told no one about the discovery, not even the girls, though keeping the secret became increasingly difficult as the weight of it pressed against every ordinary moment. She paid rent on the apartment for the final time, knowing the eviction notice in her pocket had lost its power. She worked her shifts at the restaurant, moving through motions that felt hollow now, aware that her life had already changed in ways that would only become visible later. Dr. Carr arrived with 3 other specialists, each carrying equipment in reinforced cases. Sarah met them at the cathedral's entrance early on a Saturday morning, the neighborhood still quiet, the light soft and gray. She had explained the general situation over the phone, the hidden chamber, the boxes, the stones. But Dr. Carr's expression when she first descended the staircase confirmed that even preparation could not diminish the impact of seeing it firsthand. The team worked methodically, setting up lights that filled the chamber with a brightness it had never held. They documented the space itself first, photographing the walls, the pedestal, the alcoves, creating a visual record that would support the legal claim of discovery. Then they opened the hidden panel and began the painstaking process of removing each box, cataloging its contents, and testing samples from every container. The work took 3 full days. Sarah remained present throughout, watching as the specialists weighed stones, measured their dimensions, tested their composition with instruments she did not understand. They spoke in technical terms, discussing clarity grades, inclusion patterns, and carat weight. Their voices calm and professional even as the numbers they recorded grew larger. By the end of the 3rd day, Dr. Carr approached Sarah with a leather portfolio containing the preliminary findings. They stood in the main hall, away from the others, the late afternoon light cutting through the broken roof in sharp angles. "Ms. Patterson," Dr. Carr began, her tone measured. "What we've found exceeds initial estimates significantly." Sarah waited, her hand steady despite the rapid beating of her heart. The collection contains approximately 12,000 individual stones, ranging from half a carat to 30 carats. The average quality is higher than expected, with roughly 40% falling into the upper clarity grades. Conservative estimates, accounting for loss during cutting and market variability, place the total value at $772 million. The number landed without sound. Sarah heard it, processed the words, but felt no immediate reaction. 772 million. It was too large. Too far removed from any reference point in her life to produce comprehension. She looked at Dr. Carr, searching for some indication that she had misunderstood. "That's conservative?" Sarah asked. "Yes. If market conditions are favorable and cutting is done optimally, the value could increase by 20 to 30%. But even conservatively, this is one of the largest private discoveries of rough diamonds on record." Sarah nodded slowly, still unable to fully absorb the information. "What happens now?" "Now," Dr. Carr said, closing the portfolio. "You need to make decisions. The stones need to be secured in a facility equipped to handle items of this value. You'll need to work with banks, insurers, and potentially government authorities, depending on how you want to proceed. And you'll need legal representation to manage the sale, taxation, and distribution." Distribution? Once you sell the stones, the funds will need to be structured properly. This amount of money requires careful management to avoid complications. Sarah looked past Dr. Carr toward the chamber, where the other specialists were still packing equipment. 772 million. The number began to settle, slowly, like dust after a collapse. It meant the girls would never worry about tuition, about medical bills, about housing. It meant Sarah would never have to ignore an eviction notice, never have to choose which bill to pay, never have to feel the weight of inadequacy that had shaped her life for years. "I want to do this correctly," Sarah said. "Whatever steps are necessary." Dr. Carr nodded. "Then we start with securing the collection. I'll arrange for transport to a secure vault. The process will take a few days, but it's essential." Over the following week, Sarah watched as the collection was carefully removed from the cathedral. Each box was sealed, documented, and loaded into armored vehicles under the supervision of security personnel who treated the operation with quiet efficiency. The chamber, once filled with rows of boxes, was emptied until only the stone walls and the pedestal remained. Sarah descended the stairs one final time before the transport was complete. She stood in the empty chamber, her flashlight casting long shadows across the alcoves. The space felt different now, lighter somehow, as if releasing what it had held for so long. She thought about who had hidden the diamonds, when, and why they had never returned. The history of the collection would remain uncertain, lost to time and circumstance, but its discovery had become part of her story now, inseparable from the decision to buy a ruined building no one else wanted. As she climbed back up the stairs and sealed the wooden panel for the last time, Sarah felt a shift that was not relief exactly, but something quieter. The cathedral had given her what it held, and now the responsibility was hers to manage. The building itself would remain, its walls still standing, its roof still broken, waiting for whatever came next. The news spread slowly at first, then all at once. Sarah had tried to keep the discovery private during the appraisal, but once the stones were moved to a secure facility, word began to leak through channels she could not control. An article appeared in a local business journal, vague but suggestive, mentioning a significant gemstone discovery in a recently purchased property. Within days, larger outlets picked up the story, filling in details with varying accuracy, until Sarah's name and the cathedral became linked in headlines that alternated between celebration and skepticism. Her phone began ringing constantly, reporters requesting interviews, distant relatives she had not spoken to in years, offering congratulations, financial advisors, and investment firms pitching their services. Sarah ignored most of them, relying on the legal team Dr. Carr had helped her assemble to manage communications and filter legitimate offers from opportunistic noise. Her mother called on a Tuesday evening, her voice tight in a way Sarah recognized immediately. "I saw the news." "I was going to tell you," Sarah said, though she was not certain that was true. $700 million. Her mother's tone carried disbelief more than anger. "And you didn't think to mention this before the entire city knew?" "It happened fast, Mom. The appraisal only just finished." There was a long silence. When her mother spoke again, her voice had softened slightly, but the edge remained. "I'm happy for you, Sarah. Truly. But I don't understand why you didn't come to me sooner. We're family." Sarah thought about explaining, about describing the isolation of carrying that knowledge alone, the fear of what would change once people knew. But the words felt insufficient. "I needed to be sure it was real first." Her mother exhaled slowly. "What are you going to do with it all?" "I don't know yet." Another pause. "Well, don't rush into anything." That kind of money can disappear faster than you think if you're not careful. The call ended soon after, leaving Sarah with the familiar weight of her mother's concern, now mixed with something else. Not quite approval, but recognition. The distance between them had not closed, but it had shifted, and Sarah was not certain whether that was a relief or another complication to manage. Her brother's call came later that same evening, his tone lighter, but carrying a similar undercurrent of adjustment. "So, you actually did it." "I didn't do anything," Sarah said. "I just bought a building. A building with $750 million inside it." He laughed, though it sounded forced. "That's not nothing, Sarah." They talked longer than usual, her brother asking practical questions about security and legal issues, offering advice that Sarah appreciated even when it was obvious. Toward the end of the conversation, his tone shifted to something more genuine. "Look," he said, "I was wrong. When you bought that place, I thought you were making a mistake. But you weren't. You were just seeing something the rest of us couldn't." Sarah did not respond immediately. The acknowledgment mattered more than she had expected, not because she needed his validation, but because it confirmed that the risk had not been foolish, even when it appeared that way. At work, the shift in how people treated her was immediate and uncomfortable. Janet, who had laughed weeks earlier, now approached with forced enthusiasm, asking questions about the discovery that felt more intrusive than curious. Other co-workers, who had barely acknowledged Sarah before, suddenly sought her out, offering congratulations that came with subtle requests or suggestions about how she might share her good fortune. Sarah finished her 2-week notice and left the restaurant without ceremony, aware that staying would only deepen the awkwardness. The job had been a necessity, not a career, and its absence felt like shedding weight she no longer needed to carry. The girls adjusted to the news in their own way, processing it through the lens of their limited understanding of money. Sarah had explained carefully, sitting them down one evening in the apartment that would soon cease to be their home, telling them that the cathedral had contained something valuable, something that meant they would not have to worry anymore. Emma, the younger, had asked if they were rich now, her voice carrying more curiosity than excitement. Sarah had nodded, trying to find words that would not overwhelm them. Yes, very rich. Lily, older and more cautious, had been quiet for a long time before asking, "Does that mean we can stay here?" Sarah shook her head gently. "No, but it means we can find a better place, a place where we don't have to worry about paying rent or moving again." The girls had accepted this with the resilience children often show, their concerns shifting quickly to more immediate questions about what they could buy, whether they could get a dog, if they could visit the cathedral. Sarah answered each question patiently, aware that their understanding of what had changed would unfold gradually, over months and years, as they encountered the practical realities of wealth. The apartment, once a symbol of everything Sarah could barely afford, now felt temporary in a way that brought relief rather than anxiety. She packed their belongings slowly, discarding what no longer mattered, keeping only what held meaning. The eviction notice still tucked in her pocket, she finally threw away, its power reduced to paper and ink. Finding a new home took less time than Sarah expected. The real estate agent, a polished woman in her 40s, had treated her with deference that felt both appropriate and strange. Sarah toured houses in neighborhoods she had never considered accessible, each one larger and more comfortable than the last, until she found a place that felt right. Not the largest or the most expensive, but a house with a backyard where the girls could play, windows that let in light, rooms that felt spacious without being overwhelming. The sale went through quickly, cash payment bypassing the complications of loans and approvals. When Sarah stood in the empty living room of the new house, keys in hand, she felt a shift that was not triumph exactly, but satisfaction. The weight of financial fear, which had shaped her life for years, had lifted, leaving behind a steadiness she had not expected. Yet with that steadiness came a new awareness of how people now perceived her. The discovery had made her visible in ways that were not entirely comfortable. Articles continued to appear, some celebrating the find, others questioning how someone with no background in gemstones could have stumbled upon such wealth. Strangers recognized her in public, offering comments that ranged from congratulations to thinly veiled resentment. Sarah learned quickly to move through the world differently, to deflect attention, to keep conversations brief and impersonal. She hired security consultants who advised her on privacy measures, on managing public exposure, on protecting herself and the girls from the complications that came with sudden wealth. The advice was practical and necessary, but it also underscored how thoroughly her life had changed. One afternoon, while unpacking boxes in the new house, Sarah found the notebook she had used during her first visits to the cathedral. She flipped through the pages, reading her early observations, the sketches of the floor plan, the copied symbols from the chamber. The notes felt distant now, written by someone who had not yet understood what the building held, who had been operating on instinct and desperation rather than knowledge. She thought about the moment she had lifted the first wooden panel, revealing the staircase, and how close she had come to dismissing the anomaly, to deciding it was not worth investigating. If she had left the cathedral that day without descending, if she had chosen caution over curiosity, the diamonds would still be there, hidden and forgotten, and her life would have continued along the trajectory it had been following, narrowing month by month until something broke. The discovery had not been luck, not entirely. It had been the result of decisions she made when everyone else advised against them, buying a ruined building for $1, exploring it alone despite the risks, trusting her instincts when doubt pressed from every direction. The wealth that followed was not a reward for virtue or intelligence, but the consequence of choices that could just as easily have led nowhere. Sarah closed the notebook and set it aside, aware that the story of the cathedral would be told and retold, shaped by others into narratives that fit their expectations or biases. Some would call it fortune, others destiny. A few might dismiss it as random chance. But Sarah knew the truth was simpler and more complicated than any of those explanations. She had taken a risk no one else was willing to take, and the building had given her what it held. That was all. The vindication she had imagined during the early days of the discovery felt different now that it had arrived. It was not dramatic or satisfying in the way she had expected. Her mother's acknowledgment, her brother's admission, Janet's forced enthusiasm, all of it felt muted, tinged with complexity rather than clarity. People adjusted to her new circumstances in their own ways, some with grace, others with awkwardness, and Sarah found herself caring less about their reactions than she had anticipated. What mattered more was the stability the discovery had created. The girls would have opportunities she could never have provided before. Education without debt, healthcare without delay, a future that was open rather than constrained. That was the true change, quieter than headlines, but more enduring. As evening approached, Sarah stood in the backyard of the new house, watching Emma and Lily play on the grass, their laughter carrying in the warm air. The cathedral remained across the city, its walls still standing, its purpose now uncertain. She had not returned since the diamonds were removed, unsure what role the building would play in her life going forward. It was still hers, legally and practically, a ruined structure that most people would still dismiss as worthless. But Sarah knew better. The cathedral had given her more than diamonds. It had given her proof that value existed in places others refused to look, that decisions dismissed as foolish could carry their own logic, that survival sometimes required risks that appeared reckless until they succeeded. She had bought the building for $1, been mocked for the decision, and discovered a fortune that would reshape her life and her daughters' lives in ways she was still learning to understand. The journey from eviction notice to security had been shorter than it felt, compressed into weeks that carried the weight of years. Now, standing in the backyard of a house she owned outright, watching her children play without worry, Sarah felt the full weight of what had changed. Not just the money, though that mattered, but the shift from powerlessness to control, from desperation to choice. The cathedral had given her that, and no amount of doubt or mockery from others could diminish it. The fortune remained in secure facilities, being processed, appraised, prepared for sale. The legal team moved forward with plans to structure the wealth in ways that would protect it and maximize its benefit. The security measures remained in place, ensuring privacy and safety. All of it would continue, a machinery of management and planning that would shape her life for years to come. But in this moment, with the sun setting and the girls laughing, Sarah allowed herself to simply stand and be present. The cathedral had been a gamble, the kind that should not have succeeded, yet it had. And now, because of it, she stood on solid ground for the first time in years, unshakable and certain, ready for whatever came next. The weeks that followed the move into the new house brought a rhythm Sarah had not experienced in years. There were no urgent bills, no calculations about which payment to delay, no fear that a single unexpected expense would cascade into catastrophe. The girls settled into their new rooms, their initial excitement giving way to the comfortable familiarity of routine. Emma asked fewer questions about the money now, her focus shifting to school and friends, while Lily remained more observant, watching Sarah with an attention that suggested she understood more than she said about how their lives had changed. The legal process of managing the diamond collection moved forward with methodical efficiency. Sarah's attorneys coordinated with auction houses, private buyers, and investment firms, negotiating terms that would maximize value while ensuring the transactions remained legally sound. The initial sales began in the 3rd month after the discovery, diamonds cut and certified being offered to collectors and jewelry manufacturers who paid prices that still felt abstract despite their precision. Money began flowing into accounts structured to minimize tax exposure and maximize long-term stability. Sarah sat through meetings with financial advisors who presented portfolios, investment strategies, and wealth management plans with the same careful professionalism Dr. Carr had shown during the appraisal. She signed documents, asked questions, made decisions that would shape the security of the wealth for generations. The process was exhausting in its complexity, but necessary. Through it all, the cathedral remained. Sarah returned to visit it one morning in late autumn, driving across the city alone while the girls were at school. The building looked unchanged from the outside, its stone walls still blackened, its roof still broken, its windows still empty. She parked across the street and sat for a long time, watching the structure as if it might reveal something new. Eventually, she crossed the street and entered through the same gap in the boards she had used months earlier. Inside, the light was softer now, filtered through clouds rather than falling in sharp shafts. The main hall was exactly as she remembered, debris scattered across the floor, stone columns rising toward the damaged roof, the space holding its quiet dignity despite the destruction. Sarah walked to the area where the wooden panels had covered the staircase. They were still in place, secured again after the transport team had finished their work. She knelt and ran her hand across the charred wood, feeling its texture, remembering the moment she had first lifted it to reveal what lay below. The chamber beneath was empty now, its alcoves cleared, its pedestal standing alone in the darkness. Sarah did not descend again. There was no need. The space had given up its secret, and what remained was only stone and shadow. A reminder of what had been rather than a promise of what might still be found. She stood and turned slowly, looking at the cathedral's interior with fresh awareness. The building had served its purpose, though she still did not fully understand why the diamonds had been hidden there or who had placed them. The research her legal team had conducted suggested the collection dated to the 1920s or 1930s, likely hidden during the economic instability of that era, but no definitive records had surfaced. Whoever had sealed the chamber had done so with the intention of returning, yet they never had. Their reasons, their fate, remained unknown. Sarah accepted that mystery as part of the building's history, something that would never be fully resolved. What mattered was that she had been the one to discover it, that her willingness to take a risk everyone else dismissed had led to this outcome. As she prepared to leave, Sarah paused near the entrance and looked back one final time. The cathedral, for all its ruin, still held a kind of presence. It was not beautiful in any conventional sense, but it was enduring, stubborn in its refusal to collapse entirely. She thought about what to do with it now. Restoration was possible, though expensive and complicated. Demolition remained an option, clearing the lot for sale or redevelopment. Or she could leave it as it was, a monument to what had been found there, a structure that had served its purpose and now rested in the aftermath. The decision did not feel urgent. For the first time in her life, Sarah had the luxury of time, of considering options without pressure. She left the building and crossed back to her car, the autumn air cool against her face, carrying the faint smell of approaching rain. Back at the new house, Sarah found the girls already home from school, Emma building something with blocks in the living room, while Lily read on the couch. They looked up when she entered, offering brief smiles before returning to their activities, the normalcy of the moment striking Sarah with unexpected force. This was what the discovery had purchased, not just material comfort, but the ability to have ordinary afternoons where nothing dramatic happened, where the girls could simply exist without the shadow of instability. That evening, after dinner, Lily asked a question that had clearly been forming for some time. "Mom, are people going to treat us differently now?" Sarah set down her fork, considering how to answer. "Some people will. Some already have." "Is that bad?" "It's complicated," Sarah said. "Some people will like us because of the money, and some will resent us for it. But the people who matter, the ones who care about us for who we are, they won't change." Lily nodded, processing this. "Do we have to tell people?" "About the money?" Sarah shook her head. "No, we can keep that private. But people will know anyway because of the news. We just have to decide how much we let that affect us." The conversation moved on, but Sarah thought about Lily's question long after the girls had gone to bed. The visibility that came with the discovery had been unavoidable, but it did not have to define them. She could manage the wealth quietly, raise the girls without flaunting what they now had. Ensure they understood that the money was a resource, not an identity. Over the following months, Sarah established patterns that would sustain them. She hired a private tutor to supplement the girls' education, not because the public school was inadequate, but because she wanted to give them opportunities she had never had. She set up trust funds structured to provide for their future, without overwhelming them with immediate access to wealth they could not yet manage responsibly. She donated quietly to causes that mattered, organizations supporting single parents, affordable housing initiatives, community programs that helped people in situations similar to the one she had escaped. The donations were substantial, but anonymous, made through the legal structures her advisors had created. Sarah did not want recognition for generosity that felt like obligation more than virtue. She had been given something extraordinary, and passing some of it forward felt necessary, a way of acknowledging that the discovery could just as easily not have happened, that her current security rested on circumstances as much as decisions. Word of the anonymous donation spread eventually, traced back to her despite efforts to maintain privacy. Articles appeared praising her philanthropy, though they made her uncomfortable in ways the wealth itself had not. She was not a hero. She was someone who had found money and chosen to share some of it. The distinction mattered to her, even if it did not to those writing the stories. Her mother called one evening after seeing one such article. The conversation was brief, her tone warmer than it had been in years. "I saw what you're doing with the donations. It felt right," Sarah said simply. "Your father would have been proud." The words caught Sarah off guard, bringing unexpected emotion. Her father had died when she was young, his memory preserved in fragments that felt distant now. But the thought that he would have approved carried weight she had not anticipated. "Thank you," Sarah said quietly. After the call ended, she sat in the quiet living room of the new house, thinking about how the discovery had rippled outward, changing not just her circumstances, but her relationships, her sense of obligation, her understanding of what mattered. The diamonds had been valuable, yes, but their true impact lay in the space they had created. The freedom to make choices that were not dictated by desperation. As winter approached, Sarah returned to the cathedral one last time. She had made her decision about its future. The building would be restored, not as a residence, but as a community center, a space that could serve the neighborhood in ways the original church once had. The project would take years, require significant investment, and likely never recoup its costs. But it felt appropriate, a way of returning something to the structure that had given her so much. She met with architects and contractors, explaining her vision, working through plans that would preserve the stone walls and iconic features while making the interior functional for modern use. The process was complex, but it gave the cathedral purpose again, ensuring it would not simply stand as a ruin or be demolished for convenience. On the day the restoration officially began, Sarah stood across the street with the girls, watching as workers cleared debris and scaffolding began to rise along the exterior walls. Emma and Lily asked questions about what the building would become, their interest genuine but uncomplicated, viewing it as another project rather than the source of their changed circumstances. Sarah answered their questions patiently, aware that the full story of the cathedral would unfold for them gradually as they grew older and understood more about what had happened. For now, it was enough that they knew the building mattered, that their mother had found something valuable there, and that she was using part of that value to create something useful for others. As they drove home, the cathedral receding in the rearview mirror, Sarah felt a sense of completion that had been absent since the discovery. The wealth had been secured, the legal complications managed, the future stabilized. The building that had started it all would be preserved and transformed, and her life, which had once been defined by scarcity and fear, now held possibilities she was still learning to navigate. The journey from eviction notice to security had been improbable, shaped by decisions that should not have worked, but did. She had bought a ruined cathedral for $1, been mocked and doubted, and discovered a fortune no one knew existed. The vindication had come, quieter than she expected, but undeniable. Now, driving through the city with her daughters beside her, Sarah understood that the true gift of the discovery was not the money itself, but the ground it had given her to stand on. Solid, unshakable ground, where she could build a life free from the constant pressure of survival, where her daughters could grow without the weight of financial fear, where choices could be made based on what mattered rather than what was merely possible. The cathedral had given her that, and in return, she would ensure it stood for others, a testament to endurance, to hidden value, and to the stubborn refusal to accept that something dismissed as worthless could not hold within it the seeds of transformation. The restoration of the cathedral attracted attention Sarah had not anticipated. What she had intended as a quiet transformation, a personal project managed through contractors and architects, became something more public within weeks of breaking ground. Local news covered the story, framing it as a redemption narrative, the ruined church brought back to life by the woman who had discovered fortune within its walls. The coverage was mostly positive, but it carried an intensity that made Sarah uncomfortable, as if her decisions were being weighed and judged by an audience she had not invited. Reporters requested interviews, asking questions about her plans, her motivations, why she chose to restore the building rather than simply pocket the wealth and move on. Sarah declined most requests, offering only brief written statements through her legal team. She was not interested in becoming a public figure, in having her life shaped by media narratives that simplified everything into clean arcs of struggle and triumph. The reality was messier than that, more ambiguous, and she preferred to keep it private. Yet privacy became increasingly difficult to maintain. The cathedral itself, now surrounded by scaffolding and construction barriers, drew visitors. People stopped on the sidewalk to take photographs, to peer through gaps in the fencing, to speculate about what the interior would become. Some left notes at the entrance, thanking Sarah for investing in the neighborhood, expressing hope that the center would serve the community well. Others left criticism, questioning why someone with so much wealth would bother with a single building when larger problems demanded attention. Sarah read these notes when she visited the site, collecting them from where they accumulated near the entrance. The gratitude she accepted with quiet acknowledgment, aware that her actions had meaning beyond her own intentions. The criticism stung more than she expected, not because it was wrong exactly, but because it assumed she owed something beyond what she had already chosen to give. The donations she had made, the trust funds established for the girls, the restoration itself, none of it felt like enough when measured against the scale of need that existed everywhere. Yet she could not solve everything, and the expectation that wealth obligated her to try felt like a burden she had not agreed to carry. One afternoon, while reviewing construction progress with the lead architect, Sarah noticed a man standing across the street, watching the building. He was older, perhaps in his 70s, wearing a faded coat and holding a cane. His attention was fixed on the cathedral's facade, with an intensity that suggested more than casual interest. Sarah excused herself from the conversation and crossed the street, approaching carefully. "Can I help you?" she asked. The man turned slowly, his eyes moving from the building to her face. "You're the owner." It was not a question, but Sarah nodded anyway. Yes. I grew up attending services here, the man said, his voice rough with age. Before the congregation disbanded. Haven't seen the building in 40 years, maybe more. Heard it was being restored. Sarah waited, sensing he had more to say. My father worked here, the man continued. Maintenance, odd jobs, whatever the church needed. He knew this building better than anyone. Did he ever mention anything unusual about it? Sarah asked, unable to stop herself. Anything hidden or secured in a particular way? The man's expression shifted, something crossing his face that might have been recognition or caution. Why do you ask? Sarah hesitated, weighing how much to reveal. I found something when I first explored the building, something that had been hidden for a long time. I've always wondered who placed it there. The man was quiet for a long moment, his gaze returning to the cathedral. My father told me once, near the end of his life, that the church had held more than faith. He said people brought what they valued, things they couldn't trust to banks after the crashes in the 30s. The church kept it safe, or tried to. Did he say what happened to those items? He said most were returned when things stabilized, but some people never came back. Died, moved away, forgot. The church kept what remained, sealed it away when the congregation couldn't maintain the building anymore. He said it was meant to be temporary, until someone with authority decided what to do with it. But authority never came, and eventually, everyone who knew forgot. Sarah absorbed this, the pieces of the story clicking into place. Your father sealed the chamber. The man nodded slowly. If you found what I think you found, yes. He told me he did it carefully. Made it so only someone looking deliberately would discover it. He figured if the building stood long enough, whoever owned it eventually would have a right to what was inside, since no one else claimed it. He was right, Sarah said quietly. They stood together in silence, watching the construction workers move across the scaffolding. After a while, the man spoke again. He would have liked knowing it went to someone who's doing something with it, not just taking and leaving. The conversation ended soon after, the man departing with a final glance at the cathedral. Sarah stood alone, processing what she had learned. The mystery of the diamond's origin had not been fully solved, but it had been contextualized, given a shape that made sense. The building had served as a vault, a place of trust during chaos, and when that trust was never reclaimed, it had waited, patient and silent, until she arrived. As winter deepened, the restoration progressed. The roof was rebuilt first, a massive undertaking that required cranes and specialized crews. Sarah visited often, watching as the broken sections were removed and replaced with new beams and materials that matched the original design. The sound of construction filled the space, hammers and saws echoing through the stone walls, replacing the silence that had dominated for decades. Emma and Lily came with her sometimes, their initial interest in the project giving way to boredom as the work stretched on. They preferred the new house, its comfort and familiarity, and Sarah did not push them to engage with the cathedral more than they wanted. It was enough that they knew the building existed, that their mother cared about it, that it represented something important, even if they could not yet understand exactly what. One evening, while sitting in her home office reviewing financial reports, Sarah received a call from her lead attorney. His tone was careful, professional, but carried an undertone that suggested complication. Ms. Patterson, we've received a claim regarding the diamond collection. Sarah's chest tightened. What kind of claim? A descendant of one of the original congregation members has come forward with documentation suggesting their family deposited items with the church in 1933. They're arguing they have a right to a portion of the discovered assets. How strong is their case? Not particularly strong, the attorney said. Their documentation is fragmentary, and they can't prove definitively that what they deposited matches what you found. But they're threatening litigation if we don't negotiate a settlement." Sarah closed her eyes, feeling the weight of complications she had known would come eventually. "What do you recommend?" "We can fight it. The legal precedent is in your favor as the property owner. But litigation would be expensive, time-consuming, and public. Alternatively, we could offer a nominal settlement to avoid the hassle." "How nominal?" $5 to $10 million. Enough to make them go away without setting a precedent that encourages other claims. Sarah thought about the number, its scale relative to what she had, its implications for how she wanted to handle the wealth. "Let them file," she said finally. "If their claim is legitimate, the courts will decide. If it's not, I'm not paying them to disappear." That's a risky approach. It's the right one. The lawsuit was filed 3 weeks later, attracting media attention that framed the case as a battle between old money and new, between legacy claims and property rights. Sarah's attorneys handled the proceedings, shielding her from most of the direct conflict, but the case cast a shadow over everything. The claimants appeared in interviews, presenting themselves as victims of circumstance, descendants of hard-working people who had trusted the church with their savings, only to have it claimed by someone who happened to buy the building for $1. The narrative was compelling in its simplicity, and public opinion divided. Some sided with Sarah, arguing she had done nothing wrong and owed nothing to people who could not prove their connection to the discovered items. Others felt the claimants deserved compensation, that Sarah's wealth gave her an obligation to share with those who had less, regardless of legal technicalities. Sarah read the articles and comment sections sparingly, aware that engaging too deeply with public opinion would only fuel her frustration. She believed in the legitimacy of her ownership, the due process that had verified it, the legal principles that supported her position. Yet she also understood that belief and public perception did not always align, and that the lawsuit would shape how people viewed her regardless of its outcome. The case moved slowly through the courts, each motion and counter-motion adding months to the timeline. During this period, Sarah focused on what she could control. The cathedral restoration continued without interruption, its progress visible to anyone who passed by. The walls were cleaned and repaired, the windows replaced with new glass that approximated the original designs. The interior was gutted and rebuilt, creating spaces for meeting rooms, classrooms, a community kitchen, a small performance area. She worked with local organizations to develop programming that would serve the neighborhood once the center opened. After-school programs for children, job training workshops, support groups for single parents, all structured around the principle that the building should give back more than it took. The planning was extensive, requiring coordination with nonprofits and city agencies, but it gave the project substance beyond mere restoration. As spring arrived, the lawsuit reached its conclusion. The judge ruled in Sarah's favor, determining that the claimants had failed to establish a clear connection between their ancestors' deposits and the specific items found in the cathedral. The decision was thorough, citing property law, historical precedent, and the burden of proof required for such claims. The claimants were ordered to cover legal costs, a detail that felt vindicating even as Sarah recognized the ruling would not resolve the underlying tensions. The media coverage of the verdict was mixed. Some outlets praised the decision as upholding property rights and legal clarity. Others criticized it as an example of wealth protecting itself, using legal machinery to deny legitimate claims from families with fewer resources. Sarah issued a brief statement through her attorneys, expressing respect for the judicial process and reiterating her commitment to using the building for community benefit. She did not celebrate the victory publicly, aware that doing so would only deepen the perception that she was indifferent to the claimant's circumstances. In private, she felt relief more than triumph. The lawsuit had been a distraction, a source of stress that had shadowed the restoration for months. Its resolution allowed her to focus fully on completing the project, on ensuring the cathedral would serve the purpose she had intended. By summer, the building was nearly finished. The exterior looked transformed, its stone walls cleaned to reveal colors that had been hidden beneath decades of soot. The roof stood complete, solid and weatherproof. Inside, the spaces had been furnished and equipped, ready for the programming that would begin in the fall. Sarah walked through the completed areas with a mixture of satisfaction and exhaustion, aware of how much effort had gone into bringing the building back to life. The official opening was scheduled for late September, timed to coincide with the start of the school year and the rollout of after-school programs. Sarah worked with a small team to organize the event, keeping it modest despite suggestions that it should be larger, more celebratory. She wanted the focus to remain on the building and its purpose, not on herself or the story of the discovery. On the morning of the opening, Sarah arrived early, walking through the empty halls before anyone else arrived. The light through the new windows created patterns on the floor that reminded her of that first visit months ago, when the building had been nothing but ruin and possibility. She stood in the main hall, now transformed into a multi-purpose space with polished floors and functional lighting, and allowed herself a moment of quiet reflection. The cathedral had given her what it held, and she had returned something in kind. The exchange felt balanced in a way that satisfied her more than any financial calculation could. The building would outlast her, serving people who would never know its full history, who would use its spaces without understanding the fortune that had been hidden beneath their feet. That anonymity felt appropriate, a way of ensuring the building's purpose remained separate from the story of its transformation. People began arriving as morning gave way to afternoon. Families from the neighborhood, representatives from partnering organizations, city officials who had supported the project. Sarah greeted them briefly, then stepped back, allowing others to speak about the programs and opportunities the center would provide. She listened to their words, their gratitude and optimism, and felt the weight of responsibility that came with creating something meant to endure. Emma and Lily attended with her, dressed carefully for the occasion, their demeanor more serious than usual. They had helped cut the ribbon at Sarah's request, a symbolic gesture that acknowledged their connection to the building even if they didn't fully understand it yet. Afterward, they explored the spaces with other children, their laughter echoing through halls that had been silent for so long. As the event wound down and people began to leave, Sarah stood outside, watching the late afternoon light fall across the cathedral's facade. The building looked solid now, permanent, as if the years of ruin had been erased. Yet Sarah knew the history remained, embedded in the stones, in the chamber beneath the altar, in the decisions made by people long dead that had shaped everything that followed. She thought about the man she had spoken to months earlier, whose father had sealed the chamber with care and intention. She thought about the families who had trusted the church with their valuables, some of whom had never returned to reclaim them. She thought about her own journey, from eviction notice to security, driven by a gamble no one else had been willing to make. The cathedral stood as a monument to all of it, not in a grand or obvious way, but in its simple persistence. It had survived fire, abandonment, and decades of neglect. It had held secrets no one knew, protected what it was given, and waited patiently for someone to discover what it contained. Now it would serve a different purpose, offering space and opportunity to people who needed both, continuing the work it had begun a century earlier in a form adapted to new times. Sarah turned away from the building and walked toward her car, where the girls waited. The opening had been successful. The programming would begin soon, and the cathedral would take on a life of its own, independent of her daily involvement. That separation felt necessary, a way of ensuring the building belonged to the community rather than to her alone. As she drove home through the city, the cathedral receding in the rearview mirror, Sarah understood that the story was not finished, but her role in it was changing. She had discovered the fortune, survived the complications, restored the building, and opened it to others. What came next would be shaped by different hands, different needs, different visions of what the space could become. The wealth remained, secured and managed, providing stability for her daughters and resources for causes she believed in. But the cathedral, the place where it had all begun, now belonged to something larger than herself. That felt right, a fitting end to the journey that had started with desperation and a $1 bid, and had led to transformation she could never have anticipated. The building would stand long after she was gone, its stone walls enduring as they always had, holding new stories, new purposes, new lives within their embrace. And somewhere beneath it all, the empty chamber waited in darkness, a reminder of what had been found and what had been given back, a space that had served its purpose and now rested in silence, complete. 3 years passed before Sarah fully understood what the cathedral had become. The initial programming had expanded beyond her original vision, shaped by the community's needs in ways she had not anticipated. What had started as after-school programs and job training workshops had grown to include a food pantry, legal aid clinics, mental health counseling, and a rotating series of cultural events that drew people from across the city. The building operated 6 days a week, its halls filled with voices and movement that would have seemed impossible during those early days when Sarah had first stepped through the gap in the boarded entrance. She visited less frequently now, deliberately stepping back to allow the center's director and staff to operate without her constant presence. Her involvement had shifted from active management to quiet support, attending board meetings, reviewing financial reports, approving expansions when funding allowed. The distance felt necessary, a recognition that the building needed to belong to those it served rather than to the person who had made its restoration possible. Yet certain moments still drew her back. One Thursday afternoon in October, Sarah received a call from the center's director, a woman named Patricia Chen, who had transformed the vague ideas Sarah had outlined into functioning programs with measurable impact. "I thought you'd want to know," Patricia said, her voice carrying warmth that professional distance could not entirely contain. "We just enrolled our 5,000th participant, a single mother with 3 kids, just moved to the neighborhood. She came in looking for after-school care and left signed up for our job placement program too." Sarah felt something tighten in her chest, not quite emotion, but recognition. 5,000. In 3 years. The board wanted to mark it somehow, maybe a small celebration. I wanted to check with you first. "Do what feels right," Sarah said. "You don't need my approval for that." "I know, but you should be there if you're willing." Sarah agreed, then ended the call and sat quietly in her home office, thinking about numbers. 5,000 people had walked through the cathedral's doors, seeking something they needed. Not all had found it, surely, but enough had, that the center's reputation had spread beyond the immediate neighborhood. It had become a place people knew about, recommended, trusted. That transformation, from abandoned ruin to community anchor, felt more significant than any single discovery, even one worth hundreds of millions. The celebration, when it occurred 2 weeks later, was modest. A small gathering in the main hall, representatives from partner organizations, a few local officials, families who had benefited from the programs. Patricia spoke briefly about the center's growth, its plans for expansion, the waiting lists that existed for certain services. She mentioned Sarah's role only in passing, framing it as the initial investment that had made everything possible, then moving quickly to acknowledge the staff and volunteers whose daily work sustained the mission. Sarah stood near the back, listening, watching the faces of people who had no idea about the diamonds, about the chamber beneath their feet, about the improbable sequence of events that had led to this building being available when they needed it. Their ignorance felt like a gift, protecting them from the burden of knowing how close the cathedral had come to demolition, how easily it could have been lost. After the speeches concluded, a woman approached Sarah, younger, perhaps in her late 20s, holding the hand of a small boy. "You're Miss Patterson." Sarah nodded, recognizing the uncertainty in the woman's posture, the way she held herself as if ready to retreat at any moment. "I'm Maria. My son Carlos. He's been in the after-school program for 6 months." She paused, gathering words. "I wanted to thank you. I work 2 jobs, and before we found this place, I didn't know where he'd go after school. He was with neighbors who couldn't really watch him, or alone sometimes. Now he's here, learning, safe. It's changed everything." Sarah looked at the boy, who was staring at the floor, shy or bored, she could not tell which. "I'm glad it's helping. The job program, too," Maria continued. "They helped me get certified for medical billing. I start a new position next month, better pay. 1 job instead of 2. I'll actually see my son in the evenings." The words settled over Sarah with a weight she had not expected. This was not abstract impact measured in statistics. It was a specific life, altered by the availability of resources that had not existed 3 years earlier. She thought about her own desperation, the eviction notice, the fear of what would happen to Emma and Lily if she could not find a solution. Maria's situation echoed that fear, and the cathedral had offered her what it had offered Sarah: a way forward when other paths had closed. "I'm happy for you," Sarah said, meaning it more than the simple phrase could convey. Maria smiled briefly, then guided her son back toward the refreshment table, disappearing into the small crowd. Sarah remained where she stood, watching the gathering, aware that similar stories existed for dozens, perhaps hundreds, of the 5,000 people who had passed through the center. Each one carried its own specifics, its own complications, its own small victories that would never make headlines, but mattered immensely to those who lived them. As the event concluded and people began to leave, Patricia approached. "Thank you for coming." "Of course. I wanted to ask you something." Patricia hesitated, choosing words carefully. "We've been approached about expanding to other locations. Other neighborhoods with similar needs. The model works, and there's demand. But it would require significant additional funding and oversight." Sarah understood immediately what was being asked. "You want to know if I'll support expansion. The board thinks you should make that decision, given your role in founding this location." Sarah considered the question, its implications extending far beyond the immediate request. Supporting expansion would mean greater involvement, more visibility, a deepening commitment to something that had already consumed more of her life than she had initially planned. Yet refusing would mean limiting the center's impact, preserving this single location while needs existed elsewhere. "Let me think about it," Sarah said. "I'll have an answer by the end of the month." Patricia nodded, accepting the delay without pressure. They spoke briefly about other matters, logistical details, and upcoming events. Then Sarah made her exit, walking through the cathedral's entrance into the cool autumn evening. Sitting in her car, she pulled out her phone and scrolled through messages, finding one from Lily sent earlier that day. Her older daughter, now 12, had grown into a perceptive observer of the world around her, asking questions that required careful answers. The message was simple. "Mom, can we talk tonight about the college fund? I have questions." Sarah smiled faintly, recognizing that the girls' awareness of their circumstances was shifting, moving from the vague understanding of childhood into something more analytical. They had grown up with wealth, but not in ways that made it obvious to outsiders. The house was comfortable, but not ostentatious. They attended good schools, but not elite private institutions. Sarah had been deliberate about maintaining that balance, wanting them to understand the value of what they had without becoming defined by it. That evening, after dinner, Lily sat across from Sarah at the kitchen table, a notebook open in front of her. Emma, now 10, lingered nearby, listening but pretending not to. "I've been reading about college costs," Lily said, her tone businesslike, "and I don't understand why we need a fund. Can't we just pay?" Sarah had anticipated this conversation eventually, though its arrival still caught her slightly unprepared. "We can. But the fund is structured to teach you both about financial planning, understanding how money grows, how to budget, how to make decisions about spending and saving. But we have hundreds of millions," Lily said, not quite a question. Sarah paused, measuring her response. "We do. But that doesn't mean you should think of it as unlimited. Wealth that's not managed carefully can disappear. And more importantly, having money doesn't exempt you from understanding how to handle it responsibly." Emma spoke from her position near the counter. "Are we rich because of the church?" "Yes," Sarah said simply. "Did you know there was money inside when you bought it?" "No. I bought it because I needed somewhere to go and we were about to be evicted. The money was a surprise." Lily leaned forward. "So it was luck?" Sarah considered the question, aware that her answer would shape how the girls understood their circumstances. "It was luck that the diamonds were there, but it was a choice to buy the building when everyone else said it was foolish. Both things mattered." "Do you think we deserve it?" Lily asked, her voice carrying genuine uncertainty. "The money?" The question hung in the air, heavy with implications Sarah had wrestled with privately for years. "I don't know if deserve is the right word. We have it because a sequence of events led to me discovering it. What matters now is what we do with it." "Like the community center," Emma said. "Like the community center," Sarah agreed. "And the donations we make, and making sure you both have opportunities. And dozens of other things we'll keep deciding as we go." Lily nodded slowly, writing something in her notebook. The conversation shifted to more practical questions about college applications and career interests, but Sarah sensed the deeper inquiry would continue, evolving as the girls matured and their understanding deepened. They would need to develop their own relationship with the wealth, one that acknowledged both its benefits and its complications. Later that night, after the girls had gone to bed, Sarah sat in the quiet of the living room and returned to Patricia's question about expansion. She pulled out her laptop and reviewed the center's financials, its impact reports, the detailed proposals for additional locations. The numbers were solid, the model proven, the need undeniable. Yet expansion would mean something more than financial commitment. It would mean accepting a larger public role, becoming more visible as the person behind the initiative. Sarah had spent 3 years trying to minimize that visibility, to let the work speak for itself. Expansion would make that harder, perhaps impossible. She would become known not just as the woman who found diamonds, but as someone building a network of community centers, a philanthropist with intentions and goals that would invite scrutiny and opinion. The prospect made her uncomfortable, but not enough to refuse. Maria's face returned to her mind, the quiet gratitude, the tangible difference the center had made in her life. If that could be replicated in other neighborhoods, for other families facing similar struggles, the personal discomfort felt like an acceptable cost. Sarah drafted an email to Patricia, brief and direct. She would support expansion to 2 additional locations initially, with funding for 5 years of operations. After that period, the centers would need to demonstrate self-sustainability or secure alternative funding. The commitment was substantial but bounded, large enough to make real impact without becoming an indefinite obligation. She sent the email, then closed her laptop and sat in the darkness, listening to the quiet sounds of the house. The decision felt right, aligned with what the cathedral had taught her about taking risks that seemed improbable, but carried the possibility of significant return. Over the following months, plans for the new centers took shape. Locations were identified in neighborhoods with demographic and economic profiles similar to the original site. Buildings were acquired, renovations planned, staff hired. Sarah remained involved at a strategic level, approving major decisions, but delegating operational details to people with more expertise. The process was smoother than the first restoration, informed by lessons learned and supported by organizational infrastructure that had not existed 3 years earlier. The first new center opened in the spring, a former warehouse converted into a multi-purpose community space. The second followed in early summer, a renovated school building that had stood empty for a decade. Both openings drew modest attention, local coverage that framed them as part of a growing network of community support. But the narrative had shifted. Sarah was no longer the central figure in these stories. The centers themselves had become the focus, their programming and impact taking precedence over the personal history of their funding. That shift brought Sarah a sense of relief. The initial discovery would always be part of her story, impossible to separate from how people understood her. But the centers were becoming something independent, valuable in their own right, rather than merely interesting because of their origin. That separation felt like progress, a sign that the wealth was being transformed into something with meaning beyond its own existence. On a warm evening in late July, Sarah returned to the original cathedral for a concert, a chamber music performance that had become a monthly tradition. She sat in the back row, watching the musicians on the small stage at the front, their instruments catching light from the renovated windows. The audience was mixed. Longtime neighborhood residents alongside people from other parts of the city, drawn by the quality of the performances and the unique atmosphere of the space. As the music unfolded, Sarah let her mind drift, thinking about the journey from that first desperate search for apartments she could afford to this moment of unexpected beauty. The path had been strange and improbable, marked by decisions that should not have worked, but did. The cathedral had been worthless by every conventional measure, yet it had held within it the means of transformation, not just for her, but for thousands of people who had used its spaces in the years since. When the concert ended and the audience began to disperse, Sarah remained seated, letting the hall empty around her. She thought about the chamber beneath the altar. Still there, but sealed again after the diamonds were removed, a hollow space that had served its purpose and now waited in permanent darkness. It seemed fitting, somehow, that the source of everything remained hidden, known only to a few, while the effects rippled outward in ways that could be seen and measured and felt. Sarah stood eventually and made her way toward the exit, nodding to Patricia, who was organizing cleanup near the entrance. Outside, the summer evening was fading into dusk, the air warm and still. She walked to her car slowly, aware that her connection to this building had evolved into something quieter than it had been, less about ownership and more about witnessing what had been built from the impossible foundation of a $1 purchase and a fortune no one knew existed. The cathedral would continue long after her involvement ended, serving purposes she could not predict, holding within its walls the accumulated stories of everyone who passed through. That permanence, That extension beyond her own life and control felt like the true measure of what the discovery had made possible. Not the wealth itself, but what the wealth had allowed to be created. Structures and programs and opportunities that would outlast the memory of where they came from. Sarah drove home through the quiet streets, the cathedral receding behind her, solid and purposeful against the darkening sky. The building had given her everything when she had nothing, and she had returned what she could, transforming ruin into refuge. The exchange was complete now, balanced in ways that satisfied something deep within her that had needed resolution. The story would continue, but her role in it had reached its natural conclusion, and that felt like enough. Thank you so much for watching until the end. If you loved this story, check out the other videos on your screen now. I think you'll really enjoy them. And don't forget to subscribe if you haven't already. See you in the next story.